I ran over to my father and held on to him. And we waited and waited and waited until they had all these groups separated. And then they marched us off to a place which was quite a distance into a huge building. And in this building, there were people waiting for us in striped uniforms. They were prisoners that were living there and working. This particular group, their job was to cut our hair, shave every part of our bodies, and shower. And they gave us uniforms, the striped prison uniforms. And from there, they marched us off to barracks. Barracks were quite a distance from there. There were hundreds of them lined up. And they were not very wide. There was a walkway in the middle, and there were bunks on both sides, 3 tiers and wide. So they put us in, and this is still the same day. It was already late in the day by the time we got processed. Again, starved, exhausted, but they put us into these bunks, 8 or 9 or 10 into each tier, and there was nothing on there, just the wood, just boards. There was no straw or anything. So we were lying sideways, my father in front of me and another man behind me, and I fell asleep. I was just absolutely exhausted. But in the middle of the night, I woke up with a pain on my bone. I was skinny, so the bone against the board there, and I needed to turn around terribly. There was no room to move. I couldn't do that. So I lay in agony for the rest of the night. Gosh, I never forget that. That was a horror. Finally, in the morning, they put out the light and screaming, up, everybody, up, wake up. And so we jumped off the bunks, and I walked it off, and I was okay with that for a while. And they served breakfast. The breakfast that they served was coffee and a piece of bread. The coffee was not coffee, of course. It was ersatz, which is a man-made material. I don't know what it was made of. But it was a hot liquid, which we haven't had in days. So that was very good. The bread, you wouldn't eat it today, neither would I. But hey, so I kind of swallowed my bread and drank my coffee. My father drank his coffee, and I noticed he nonchalantly put his bread in his pocket. And that was sort of strange. I says, Father, aren't you hungry? Aren't you going to eat your bread? He said, don't worry about me. He says, I'll be all right. Well, you see, my father was in the First World War. He was a prisoner for 3 years. So he kind of thought that gave him a license to be a martyr for me. He says, I'm going to save that bread for you because you're young and you're going to need that to survive. He says, I know how to do this already. He says, I'm experienced, So and that kind of broke me up, and I started screaming at him. And but I won that victory because I made him eat the bread, and he did. And the next morning, they got us up, and they served breakfast. And after the breakfast, they lined us up outside the barracks. There was maybe 100, 120 out in that particular building. Mostly people from our hometown, a lot of people from neighboring towns, but many of the older people knew older people. But anyhow, as we were lined up and waiting, and suddenly about a half a dozen Nazi officers came up, and they started looking over the group and pointing fingers, do, meaning you. He says, come out. And they came out, and they marched him off. There's about 24 men. And my father was one of them, and some of his friends, and one in particularly who was his best friend, who also had his son there who was exactly my age. We were buddies. Shimi, we called him. His Hebrew name was Shimshon. So I started screaming and crying. I said, Shimi, we will never see them again. I just had this feeling in my gut, and I carried on. And he got very upset with me. He says, "Oh, shut up." He says, don't say that. They'll be back tonight. You'll see." I said, "Sure, you know." And for the rest of the day, I was just sort of numb. I didn't know. I didn't care what happens anymore. So we were in Auschwitz for 9 days. And it was 9 days, saw some horrible things going on. But after 9 days, they put us on a train and for about 2 days and 2 nights. And they took us from there, from Auschwitz, which was in Poland, to Mauthausen, which was a notorious camp in Austria.